All right, so to give you a good example of when to use a straight-through cable and when to use a crossover cable, I've created a couple matrices for you to show the difference of when to use a straight-through or when to use a crossover cable. So if you're connecting a switch to a router, you'd use a straight-through cable. A typical switch to PC connection, you use a straight-through cable. Connecting a hub to a host, again, straight-through cable, and so on. Connecting things like switches to other switches, you need a crossover cable. Switches to hubs, or interestingly, things we don't do often, like a router to a server or a router to router type communication, you'd use a crossover cable. Now, I used to hear the old adage, students would say, if you're connecting like devices, use a crossover cable. If you're connecting unlike devices, use a straight-through cable. And that generally is true, but there are cases where it doesn't work. For instance, if I'm connecting a router to a PC, those aren't necessarily like devices, but you do in fact need a crossover cable to make that work. Or a printer to a PC with nothing else in between. In that case, you need a crossover cable. So I came up with another way to do this cable matrix here, where you ask yourself a question before you plug in both sides. So the question is the device I'm plugging into, is this end a Ethernet DCE device? So it's a yes-no question. Now, a DCE device would be any bridge, switch, or hub. And really what a DCE, DTE explanation, we'll see more of that on a serial side of things, but there's a definition for Ethernet. On the serial side of things, the DCE device transmits on the receive pair and receives on the transmit pair, and it's specifically designed to do that, where a DTE device, which would be pretty much everything else we have, any normal network interface card on a PC or a server or a Ethernet card on a printer, would in fact be DTE, where it transmits on the transmit pair and receives on the receive pair. So a DCE device, again, bridges, switches, and hubs, is where you'd say yes to this question. You ask yourself that question on both sides of the cable. So if I plug it into one device, is it yes or no? And plug it into the other device, yes or no? And you find that if it's yes on both sides, you need a crossover cable. If it's no on both sides, you also need a crossover cable. But if it's yes on one side and no on the other, you need a straight-through cable. Now, the other way to figure this out is you just plug it in and look for the lights. If the lights come on, probably going to work. Using a network example of different varieties of unshielded twisted pair, in this case we have a switch plugged into a router or a switch plugged into a couple servers. In this case we're using straight through unshielded twisted pair. In the case of switch-to-switch communication, we're using crossover cables, and in the case of PCs or printers plugged into these same switches, we're using straight-through cables. So let's actually take a look at the process of creating an Ethernet cable and tipping out an Ethernet cable and testing it after we're done.